Okay, yay. We are on part 4 of cardiovascular system, and it's going to be a quick one. So let's get started. We're mainly talking about components of blood and then adaptations due to training. So first, let's talk about blood composition, starting with the plasma. We've already mentioned the plasma. It's a watery component of blood. We see 90% water. There's plasma proteins and 3% nutrients, electrolytes, and hormones. So plasma makes up about 50 to 60% of our total blood volume. We see here in this picture that the plasma is this yellow component, that it's how it's depicted. We'll talk about the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets on the next few slides. So let's talk about what happens to plasma volume during intense exercise. It decreases. I would normally ask you, why do you think plasma volume decreases? And that's due to sweating. So when we sweat during intense exercise, the plasma volume decreases. This may cause blood to become more viscous, thicker, and may promote dehydration. But let's talk about an adaptation here. So we see there's an increase, and it's talking about plasma volume at rest due to training adaptations or acclimatization to hot or humid environments. So what does it mean to become acclimated or to acclimate to an environment? It's basically the process of becoming adjusted to a new climate. So this takes 2 weeks it takes about 2 weeks to fully adapt to a hot environment. Acclimatization to cold environments, I think, takes a little bit longer, but we're kind of mainly talking about a hot environment that would promote sweating. So in this case, so let's say that I am a trained athlete. I'm highly trained. What's going to happen to my plasma volume? Where the watery component's going to increase at rest. Normally I would ask, why do you think our plasma volume increases as an adaptation to exercise? The answer to this would be to increase total blood volume. This is to deal with the increased demands to pump blood to the muscles. So if the plasma volume increases, that increases our blood volume. And we already know what happens if we have an increased blood volume. There's an increased venous return, increased ventricular filling, and a greater stroke volume. It also helps to counter the effects of dehydration. Also, if we have more plasma volume, we can carry nutrients, electrolytes, hormones kind of throughout the blood to get to certain parts of the body. So it's a very positive adaptation to have an increase in plasma volume. Now let's talk about formed elements. We see now 40 to 55% of blood. A formed element is anything that is not plasma volume or water. So we have blood cells, which are called erythrocytes, and then white blood cells or platelets. So we see most of our red blood cells are or kind of make up the formed elements. We'll talk about red blood cells on the next slide, but here let's talk about platelets. So with platelets, we know that they are going to be important for blood clotting. So what is this picture showing right here? It's basically just showing damage to a blood vessel and how we have an activated platelet. And we see our activated platelets right here. These are also called thrombocytes. Thrombocytes have a 7 to 10 day lifespan, and their main role is coagulation. Coagulation is just a fancy word for blood clotting. They take this active form, and what this active formation is, it's this increase in fibrin, which you see here. These are like long protein strands. They're stringy, thick, fibrous, and they basically kind of surround all the blood cells or the platelets, and they kind of bind them all together.
In a first step towards clot formation, platelets are recruited to the site of vessel injury by now exposed molecules of the vessel wall, such as collagen and von Willebrand factor. This factor mediates the linking of platelets to collagen via a specific receptor in the platelet membrane. The resulting change of shape of the platelet from its resting state into the dendritic form indicates activation. The activated platelet in turn releases prothrombotic molecules such as adenosine diphosphate, ADP. By binding to its receptors, ADP induces aggregation. And recruits further platelets to the site. Thromboxane is another important mediator of platelet activation and aggregation. Under its influence, the platelets cross-link with each other. These interlocking mechanisms cause platelet activation to snowball. The clot grows rapidly. Activated platelets also trigger the coagulation cascade and thus the formation of thrombin. Thrombin, in turn, stimulates platelet activation even further, a continuous feedback loop. Additionally, thrombin induces the formation of fibrin for the mesh stabilizing the clot. The self-reinforcing process of platelet activation, crucial in the formation of blood clots, is an obvious therapeutic target in conditions caused by inappropriately triggered blood coagulation.
Yeah, pretty crazy on blood clotting. But yeah, so those are our platelets. Here, let's talk about red blood cells. So red blood cells, we know their main purpose is to transport oxygen via a protein called hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a cytoplasmic hemoprotein that reversibly binds oxygen. So protein and iron containing. The heme portion is the iron containing, and then the globin is the protein. So let's talk about kind of what do these red blood cells do. First, the red blood cells nuclei are removed when the red blood cells are produced. This process happens during the very last step of RBC production, meaning they cannot replicate or reproduce like other body tissues can. A red blood cell lifespan is only 4 months, so about 100 to 120 days. That's why you have to wait at least 56 days between blood donations, so your body can produce more red blood cells. But the destruction and production of our red blood cells is a very balanced process in our body. The main role that we kind of want to look at is how they transport oxygen. So we'll learn in chapter 7 how the red blood cells will pass through our lungs, and that's where they will pick up our oxygen molecules, and they'll bind onto the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygens, and so each of those hemoglobin are now called oxyhemoglobin. They each have 4 bound to them, and then once the red blood cell arrives at a tissue or a working muscle, the oxygen will release. Let's talk about where do red blood cells come from. So erythropoietin, EPO, is a hormone that's produced by the kidneys that promotes the formation of red blood cells. This formation occurs in our bone marrow of our long bones. So they're just stem cells in the red bone marrow called hemocytoblasts. And what the hemocytoblasts do is they just are cells that build up our red blood cell production. Let's now discuss some adaptations. So adaptations here, first we want to look acutely. So what is the acute change during aerobic or resistance training? So plasma will be reduced during exercise. And when we have a reduction in plasma relative to our other formed elements, referring to our red blood cells, that's called hemoconcentration. So again, hemoconcentration is just the reduction in plasma. And why does plasma get reduced? Due to sweating. Due to sweating, loss of water. So now we have less plasma relative to how many red blood cells we have. So this is called hemoadaptation. So what happens? Our body will start to produce more plasma volume, and our plasma volume will increase, and it will also increase red blood cell production. So let's talk about prolonged exercise. So prolonged exercise, this is talking about like our chronic effect, what's going to happen here. So plasma decreases by about 10 to 20% with aerobic training, and then we see with RT resistance training decrease 0 to 20. That large range depends on the intensity of the exercise that we're doing. Chronically, what happens? We already talked about plasma volume will increase. So if you're an athlete, if you exercise, if you train, your plasma volume has already increased. We talked about why does this happen? It's a positive adaptation that allows increased blood volume, and then it also allows that extra plasma to continue to carry electrolytes, nutrients throughout the body. With that increased plasma volume, that results in increase in diastolic volume, increased stroke volume, improved oxygen transport, which ultimately results in greater performance. Here's another term called hematocrit. So what is hematocrit? Percent of total blood volume composed of formed elements, mainly again talking about red blood cells. So this is kind of the only blood component that is measured in a percentage. So hematocrit's kind of easy to remember because it's the percent of total blood volume of our red blood cells. So adaptation to aerobic training, you may already know this, but trained athletes, we already said, have greater plasma volume, but they also have an increased number of red blood cells. So they have more red blood cells. What's the purpose of that? To carry more oxygen. We already mentioned erythropoietin, but there's the word again. Usually it's just abbreviated as EPO. So I already mentioned EPO, hormone produced by the kidneys, promotes the formation of red blood cells by the bone marrow. But EPO is, or I guess when you use EPO in the sense of performance enhancing substances, this is called blood doping, where you would inject your own blood or somebody else's blood of the same blood type, and you would inject this hormone, and this hormone produces more red blood cells. And so that's basically the benefit, is having more red blood cells to carry more oxygen. Another factor, or another kind of point about that, is that the limiting factor to aerobic training is lack of oxygen delivery to the muscles. And so if aerobic athletes can get more oxygen to the muscles, they can perform for longer periods of time before fatigue and perform at higher intensities before fatigue. So that's kind of the purpose of having more red blood cells, and why, being an athlete, your body adapts and does that for you. So acutely, let's talk about hemoconcentration and how it affects hematocrit. We see that hemoconcentration increases hematocrit during exercise. So in order to understand that statement, you have to understand what those two definitions mean. Think back to hemoconcentration. All that meant was a decrease or a reduction in plasma volume. And then what is hematocrit? It's an increase in the percent of our red blood cells compared to plasma, or compared to total blood volume. So if we start to sweat during exercise, so acutely I'm sweating, that means that my plasma volume is going to be reduced because I'm losing that watery component. So the hemoconcentration will increase hematocrit. So now I have a greater percentage of red blood cells in my blood volume because I lost some of that watery component due to sweating. So endurance training, ET, that's what that means, equals, or I guess results in, we have an increased red blood cells and an increase in plasma. So if you're an endurance athlete, you have kind of both of those changes. What's the benefit of these changes here? Increased total blood volume, increased oxygen delivery. So if we have more red blood cells, we can carry more oxygen to the working muscle. And if we have more plasma, less likely for us to become dehydrated. We can transport nutrients, electrolytes throughout our body. All right, let's look at this picture right here. So this basically shows hematocrit. We have an untrained and then we have an endurance trained person. So what we notice here is Hematocrit. So this is red blood cells. If you look here, it's measured in percentage, and that's what hematocrit is. It's a ratio of solids to liquids. That's kind of another way to explain it. So we have an untrained person, and we see that 45% of their, I guess, blood is made of red blood cells mainly. And then we see up here 55% is plasma. We look over at the trained, and they have a greater percentage of plasma compared to the red blood cells. But what's actually interesting is they have more red blood cells than the untrained do. So I know that's kind of hard to understand, but reading this statement, with endurance training, plasma and red blood cells increase. But when and we'll look at a graph on the next page or so, and it'll show how we have an increase in red blood cells with endurance training, but the increase in plasma kind of overshadows that increase in red blood cells. So it looks like we may not have as much red blood cells in our total component of blood, and that's mainly just due to the greater increase in plasma. Let's talk about sports anemia, because this is kind of another interesting topic that has to do with blood and being an athlete. So trained people, we see, have a decreased hematocrit, and that's what this shows right here. So trained, decreased hematocrit, we see 45 to 42. So what does that mean? Decreased hematocrit is something called sports anemia. So they still have a greater total number of red blood cells, and they have lots of hemoglobin relative to a sedentary person. But that plasma, when we look at percentage-wise, will kind of outweigh the amount of red blood cells that they have. The second question here, how do we lose iron? Anemia also has to do with loss of hemoglobin, so iron, and lack of oxygen delivery. So loss of red blood cells occurs a lot in runners. What's that due to? Rupture of red blood cells or capillaries in the foot strike. So every time your foot hits the ground, you're compressing capillaries, and that may kill off those red blood cells. So we have loss of iron there. Also, it's lost in sweat, blood, urine, and all of the contracting capillaries in our body. So that's kind of sports anemia. It's a decreased hematocrit due to loss of red blood cells with exercise, even though they do have an increase in the production of red blood cells due to training. All right. Normally, I would have the class answer each of these questions. I would call on each person or some people in class to tell me what conclusions can be drawn from the graphs below about the acute response to exercise stimulus. So let's start with cardiac output over here. And what I would normally do is just have a student explain the graph. So that's kind of all we're doing here. We're looking at peak VO2, untrained versus trained. So you see on all three of those graphs, the untrained values are on the bottom, the trained values are on the top. So the trained is in purple and the untrained is in red. So we have over here our cardiac output, and it basically shows what our explanation is cardiac output and heart rate. We can compare both together. They're going to increase linearly with an increasing work rate. So they reach a plateau at 100% of our VO2 max. So when we can't physically exercise any harder, that's when our cardiac output and our heart rate plateau or stop or slow down. So what you would write down, or what you would just have to know, is cardiac output and heart rate have a positive linear relationship with workload. The harder we work, the higher our exercise intensity gets, the higher our VO2 gets, the higher our cardiac output and heart rate get. I would also ask you what determines cardiac output, maximal cardiac output, and then heart rate max. So max cardiac output has to do with training. The more trained you are, your cardiac output can reach higher values up to the 30 liter per minute, and that's due to an increase in stroke volume. Where heart rate, we see that heart rate's going to increase linearly up to maximal, but max heart rate is determined by age. Next, we see stroke volume. So what I would ask is, what does this graph tell us? And it tells us that our trained have a higher stroke volume at rest, and we can see that there, and they have higher stroke volume during exercise. Compared to the heart rate, which you notice over here, sub-maximal heart rate in a trained person is lower than the untrained person. And all that means is that the trained person is more efficient. So looking back at this one here with the stroke volume, we see that stroke volume also plateaus around this 40, which you see about right there, 40 to 50% in the trained, 40 in the untrained. It'll plateau and kind of level off. Next, I would have you do the same thing here. So what conclusions can be drawn from the graphs below? We're looking at VO2 first. This one, again, is kind of obvious. VO2 is going to increase with an increase in workload. So as we work harder, as we exercise at higher intensities, our VO2, volume of oxygen consumed, also increases linearly. We look over here at diastolic blood pressure, systolic blood pressure, and then mean arterial pressure. So we have these three variables here. What you notice about diastolic blood pressure is it kind of stays the same from rest to exercise. It doesn't really change at all. What does change is our systolic. So systolic pressure will increase. And then you see mean arterial pressure, which is a balance between the two. It's kind of the difference between systolic and diastolic. All right, 2 more slides. Let's just kind of sum up everything. So this chart is a really great studying chart. We have resting adaptations comparing strength versus endurance training. So what we see at the top is looking at the left ventricular wall and the mass, or the wall thickness and mass. We see that it's increased in both endurance and the strength trained person. Next we come to end diastolic volume. So increased in the aerobic or endurance athlete, but not the strength trained athlete. So greater end diastolic volume, probably due to one of these variables down here, like increased plasma volume. Let's look at stroke volume. So because stroke or end diastolic volume, EDV, is greater, that's going to increase stroke volume. So more blood is able to be pumped out. We go down here and say what causes that. The increased plasma volume probably increased the total blood volume, which increases the end diastolic volume. Red blood cell mass is also increased. Again, increasing our total blood volume when both of those are larger. But you see over here with our strength trained athlete, we don't really see any changes to blood volume or blood components. And we do notice a slight decrease in hematocrit. Again, hematocrit is the percent of total blood volume composed of formed elements. So I know that part's hard to understand, but both of these increase. You just have to know that. But since the plasma volume increases more than the red blood cells, that's what causes the hematocrit to be decreased. So you can use this chart for studying purposes, but it's going to be most important to know kind of the things that I have highlighted here and made colorful for our endurance trained athlete. Last, this is a kind of summary slide for y'all to answer these questions. I will not be giving you these answers in a video lecture, but they're all in the last 4 parts of this video, or 4 parts of this chapter. So you can kind of go back through the chapter and try to answer these questions. You'll see these questions on the quiz and on the next exam. All right, that sums up our chapter 6.